Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share and discuss resources, tools, and information to equip leaders to build creative, cohesive teams through culture and leader development. Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Natasha, and today I am sharing a conversation with financial coach and leadership facilitator Kenny Simon on change initiatives, the human aspects of change, and timelines when empowering individuals to change. In this episode, Kenny and I mention the stages of grief, which originated with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. While Kubler-Ross describes how we experience grief and loss, Kenny and I highlighted how this correlates to change in the workplace and how people deal with it emotionally. The stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And these play out in multiple areas of our lives.
Good morning, Kenny. Thank you so much for joining me. Can I have you introduce yourself and tell us your style of leadership?
Good morning, Natasha. My name is Kenny Simon. I am a director in the Learning and Talent Development Group at Electronic Arts. Been there for a couple of years. Background is really in human capital, I'll call it in general. Change management, learning, org development, org effectiveness, sort of all those areas, leadership, coaching, a little bit of everything underneath that umbrella. I've been at that for over 25 years. That has passed pretty quickly. So my style of leadership, if I had to narrow it down, it's probably a mix of things. There's definitely a servant leader. And I also just believe in being a good steward over anything that you have been given. You know, like when I have a team, I don't look at myself as in terms of hierarchy, like above the team. I just sort of play a different role on the team, try to be a good steward of the things I can control and try to set very real expectations and be very direct in a nice way, very direct. And so, yeah, I would say that probably servant leader, good steward is sort of how I like to roll.
I love that. And it reminds me of something John Maxwell says, where he says, people don't work for me, we work with each other.
100%. I'm not really big into the titles very much. So yeah, absolutely subscribe to that philosophy.
Was there a specific event that empowered you to identify yourself as a leader?
It's funny, my wife thinks I have trauma from this, but I remember my parents divorcing in 1985. And I was about 10 years old and transitioning from sort of elementary school where it was sort of K through 5 and then going to what we had was middle school. I know they do lots of different things with schools now, but 6th through 8th grade was middle school. Moved to a different city, not super far away, just kind of 10 miles to the east. And at that point really had to grow up a lot, right? Like had to do a lot of things for myself. I remember riding my bike and registering myself for school. I remember first football team I played on after the divorce of my parents, I went looking for the football team because I figured they would be practicing late in the summer at some park. So I figured out where all the parks were, literally 8 o'clock in the morning, ride to the parks. If I saw kids, kind of hung out to see what they were doing and found a team. There's a great story about it too that people from my hometown of Biloxi, Mississippi, they tell it all the time. So it wasn't like I was like, oh, I'm going to be a leader. I just kind of was, it was a very real, situation that in my family, you had to do it yourself. Like my mom was a provider, but she wasn't a nurturer or anything like that, right? So you had to just get it. And she also wasn't the type to sort of, oh, honey, it'll be okay. Like she wasn't, that wasn't her style. And so we just developed a lot of independence. And I think what happens is when you are in the small circles, like a middle school, and you are a self-starter, you're very independent, you're seen as a leader, right? And people start to sort of defer to you to things, and you say, well, why are you asking me? I assume most kids were like me. And so then you play sports and you're pretty decent at sports, and they're like, oh, he's good at sports, he's a pretty good student, and people just start to sort of defer to you. So I didn't look to be leading, I just always looked to try to have some semblance of control over my life and making decisions about how I live, even as young as 11, 12 years old. It's just always been who I am.
I think that there's all different sorts of quote unquote traumatic things that happen to us, especially in childhood. But there are things that just teach us to endure in different ways so that then later when things happen, we know how to respond. Whereas other people who haven't had those types of things happen respond differently. So then people look to us like, oh, that person's a leader. And it's like, I've seen some stuff, right? So
Yes.
This is not the worst thing ever to me.
Yes. And you know how it is, Natasha, like we used to say, we like to say, I have some lived experiences, right? Or, versus learned experiences. And have been through a few things, and you just learn that most of the time, if you give yourself some space, you'll figure out something. Your initial solution to a situation kind of isn't usually the best in terms of complete outcome, but it's good to just point you in a direction and start going. Then you learn and you adjust. When you've had experiences, you just learn to do that. And that stuff translates. That stuff translates into corporate. It translates into your relationships and in terms of how you just handle life's experiences, because for some reason, life won't keep throwing stuff at us.
Yes, we just get better at either batting it away or just being like, okay, fine. It's
right.
So with that, there's so much change and so much adapting, so many different things that we have to do as humans, but also specifically as leaders. So when we think of change, sometimes our brains go to change management and the processes involved with that.
Yes.
But we forget about that human element, that human side of change. So how do you view change and its impact on people?
Yeah, at Electronic Arts, we do a couple of workshops where we talk about leading through change. And I always use a very simple example to make my audience realize the impact of change. Say, if I come into your house and I move your shoes, that's gonna bother you for a while. It may take you 2 days to figure out that Kenny took my shoes out of the hall closet and he put them, on the deck. He moved my shoes. And so for a couple of days, you're gonna be looking for your shoes in the wrong place, and you're gonna feel something about that, right? And you may be annoyed, you may be mad, you may say, oh, okay, well, they're better over there. But you are going to have some type of emotional reaction to that. And it is also, and it will take you a while to adjust to the fact that we now have a good reason for putting your shoes somewhere else. Very oversimplified example, but very real, because you know how it is. Even if you move your furniture around, it takes you a minute to sort of adjust to that. So imagine large scale change, right? And what that does to a person emotionally and how you swing back and forth on that. I call it sort of like, it's like a spectrum of change from I am not going to do this, I'm going to resist this, I don't like this, to I accept this and now I'm going to take full advantage of it. There's a spectrum. And so I think people swing back and forth on that spectrum. So when you have large change, just imagine how long it takes. It's complicated, right? Large scale change, and not only large scale change, but rapid change. Like things change quickly, but we're in a constant state of rapid change, and especially like when you talk business, there are always sort of market interrupters that make you think about doing something differently, changes some things. It could be as simple as, your iPhone charger plug changing, right? And everybody's mad now because you got to order extra and different chargers. I think we can't look at change management or change as something that is mechanical. There is an event that happens, and then there is sort of a psychological process that you go through to adjust to that. And it is very real. It is the work that I have done my whole career in terms of managing organizations through change.
I appreciate too that you said there's the process that people go through. I've personally likened it to the stages of grief, where as people are working through it, they have that anger, that denial, and they're working their way to acceptance. But I think that if people could also acknowledge, both leaders acknowledge that it happens to others, and then people acknowledge that they need to move through this and that it's normal, things are changing. And in our minds, I think people think, well, what else is going to change? What are the qualifiable things? Like, is my status going to change?
Right.
I remember we were moving offices just from one building to the other. The new building was better. People got windows and bigger offices. But when I said that we were moving to a new office, you would have thought I said, let's have a book burning party. It was
you were the bad guy. You were the bad guy. Yeah.
Yes. And so it was really taking that step back and working them through a process like the stages of grief. So what are your perspectives on like that grief or loss that comes with change?
You know what? It's funny. They're almost synonymous, right? Like it's if you think about, like, let's use it's probably not the best example to use, but like when you think about death, right? And the stages of grief that accompany that, underneath all of that, or sort of the lining in all of that, is change. and it's irreversible change. In this instance, you are forced to move forward in a different way, or to think differently about someone who used to occupy your space or occupy your heart, or maybe it was just someone who was a neighbor that you've known for 30 years and they're not there. And so you can't talk to them about how your lawn looks better than theirs. That's the thing us Southern men do, Natasha. We kind of compare lawns. And so if you think about the stages of grief, it is really just a massive, one of the most impactful life changes that you could have. And so it still falls under that umbrella of change to me. And I think those stages perfectly illustrate how people handle change. And so to me, those things are almost the same. I think grief, I think loss, it's all just a big change. And your mind does not want to undo what it is known to then figure out a new way to go. The brain wants to do things that it can call up and repeat rapidly. I am efficient. What do you mean grandma passed? But I go over for Thanksgiving and I go over Christmas and I spoil her on her birthday, and we go after church every Sunday. I take her to a restaurant, right? So she can complain about the meat being too salty. What do you mean I can't? This is real things. These are real things for me, right? What do you mean I can't do that? That is grief. That is change, right? And it's permanent. And so that is a change that you really are just sort of forced through, but people still have to move at their own pace in any change, right? Whether it's something as serious as grief or something like moving offices, right? I've been sitting in this office, Natasha, for 15 years. I'm pretty comfortable. I know where all the junk is, including stuff I should have thrown away 5 years ago. And now you want to move me to a nice, shiny office and I have to figure this all out. I really don't want to do that, right? So I consider those things to be very close to their siblings, that grief and that managing sort of change and the psychological impact of change.
I agree. And even when you mentioned like the psychological impact, our brains will not allow someone else to tell us that it's going to be better on the other side either. There's right. This is changing and we're like, I would rather have the crappy known than the great unknown. Yeah. Because like you said, our brain is just, it's efficient. I know where this is. I know where that is. I know what this means.
Yeah, it is. And, let's take it way, way back to sort of your survival, right? Like no one else can tell you that the dinosaur you see outside of your cave only eats plants. Well, when I look at it, it has a mouth big enough to swallow me up. So what if I look like a plant to him today for whatever reason, right? And so the process of change, even when the event is the same for a group of people, the process of managing that will be uniquely different. My grandmother passed, I've lost a brother, I've lost a father. We all sort of manage that change and grief differently. And it's no different. You can't tell someone to just get over it. Whether it's moving offices or losing a loved one, right? You gotta manage people through it. People got to understand what their new reality is gonna be, and they have to grow into that and get comfortable with that.
That really is that leadership side of change, where every person who shows up has a background and experiences from whether it's from childhood, whether it's from other change initiatives in this company or other companies. So this is a really big question, but how can leaders, I guess, prepare themselves to help people through change, to help manage that human side of it?
Yeah. That's a good question, because all leaders are unique in how they lead. There are sort of some concepts that I think they should be aware of. And the first thing is change is an opportunity to do something, I'll just say better, right? It might be more efficiently. It might be, we might have added more steps to the process, but there's a good reason for that. It's just an opportunity to sort of reframe sort of how we approach things. So I think if they can frame that up with the team, it's an opportunity. Going to be different. It's going to feel weird. It's going to feel wonky. I think leaders themselves too need to be comfortable managing ambiguity. That's one of the things I loved about being a consultant. It was, let's say I was working with a particular software package. Every project, even when I was let's say I put in accounts payable software application for company A, right? And and we manage the change management around that. We're pulling out their old system, we're putting in a new one, and it's not just pulling out software and pulling in software. You have people who've been using that system for 20 years, and they're gonna have a real reaction to, let's do this differently. But then, let's say we have a successful implementation, and I'm taking that same application and I'm putting it into company B now, different company, completely different things to manage. Depends on how the culture is. They may be a culture that embraces change. It's an opportunity. Whereas company A may have had people that were very comfortable doing their jobs. It was easy to do their jobs. We talked about the efficiency of the brain. I know how to do this in my sleep. You hear that a lot, right? In organizations. So I think leaders they have to be comfortable with ambiguity. And I also think they should frame it as an opportunity. And I think they should embrace that every team member is going to come along a little bit faster or slower. And sometimes the acceptance of a change masks itself. Let's say you have 10 people on a team and 7 really, they just took to the change. You're going to have a few that may be pretending to have, we really like it, right? Like, I think you need to know your individual team member. So another thing that leaders can do is get to know your team, because the more I know about Natasha, then the more I can kind of anticipate some of the ways she may embrace change, because we've been working together for a few years, and I've seen how she's managed change before, and she's seen how I've led through change, right? So not a lot of things in terms of rocket science, but I think you should definitely frame up the opportunity as the time to do something new or better or different. You should definitely make sure you're locked in and you're checked in with your individual folks, right? And how they manage change. And you definitely, as a leader, should get comfortable being in ambiguous situations. I just don't know anyone who has all of the answers to every situation all of the time. We are figuring this thing out. And I'll say underlying all of that is give yourself and the team a little bit of grace. These are words we used to not say in the corporate space, right? Oh, have some empathy, right? Psychological safety, have some grace, give yourself some space. Self-care, these words, soft words that we now know when you're managing humans are important words. This stuff is real, right? So that's the advice I would give a leader, and it's not sort of the buttoned up answer, with a bow on it that you hand to them and say, if you do these things, you got it. It's just not. There are some concepts you should just embrace and expect to have to deal with and put in your toolkit.
I love the discussion about ambiguity, because I think that's also a word that before it was like this lofty ideal that people were like, oh yeah, we can deal with, like, we know how to deal with this. But I think the reality is that is life. And if you're not part of something that's ambiguous, then the company isn't growing. You're not evolving, right? And no one in the company is. No one's comfortable with change, not even the leaders who are making change. So when you can really create an environment that is ambiguous, then by creating that environment, it will make people more comfortable while still, like you said, giving people grace, letting people be human, even though that is a newer concept, I would say, like within the last 10 years.
Natasha, it's funny, like, I think we're so busy in our little business lives, making an impact and pushing to do some great things to empower people or make money for the company. Like, we just don't think about simple concepts like anything you have never experienced is going to have some level of ambiguity, and it's going to be growth because it's new. You have not experienced the next 15, 20 minutes or today before. And you think you know what's going to happen because your brain tells you this is what we do every day. We get up, we work, we do some things we're passionate about. You read a book, you walk your dog. But there may be something that happens today that you weren't anticipating. And you're going to have to deal with that. That's new, that's growth, right? And you may learn something from it that changes the way you look at your days every day. I don't know. It's a very natural part of life. Just accept that it is going to happen. You're not going to have the answers. Like, I remember being a brand new consultant right out of college, and I went to work for Accenture. It was called Anderson Consulting at the time. And I just remember looking at the leadership, these partners, especially ones that were very experienced, and just being sort of in awe because I thought they knew all the answers. When they present to us, when we were 6 months into the firm, they had these frameworks and they had tools and templates and carried around laptops. Now, granted, back then they weighed 30 pounds and probably gave some of us scoliosis, but they looked important. I thought they had answers. As I continued to move up in that firm, and then even when I jumped over to IBM, I discovered, no, they're figuring it out. It's like we are. They're smart about a couple of things. They have sort of that. One of the things I want to implement, I know at PA, is confidence in people, right? But consultants kind of have that, right? Because a lot of what you sell to your client is the fact that this person is smart and can do it. But as I moved up and I started getting exposed to some of the mid-level and upper-level management meetings, even sitting in a room with clients, but I was still pretty young. I had a 2 in front of my age, and I was leading a pretty large team. And sitting I got invited to sit in on these meetings, and there were senior client folks, and there were the most senior people on our project, like it was the partners who sort of owned the project, even though they didn't work it day to day. And it was sort of the senior managers and managing directors that were sort of day to day running bits and pieces of it. And we were partnering with another software vendor, and they had their leadership team in there. And we just talked about everything from soup to nuts. And since I owned a big team that was doing a lot of training and comms and change management, I was sitting in on those meetings because I needed to hear these things and listening to them trying to figure it out every day, right? Or even messing it up and saying, you didn't do that right. You asked me earlier what gave me confidence to be a leader. And I talked about some of the things I did as a kid, just sort of naturally almost to like survive and just make it. I think me sitting in that meeting with people who were 10 plus years older than me, had 10 plus years more experience than I had. And I had sometimes better answers or the same questions that they had. I think that is really what, from a professional standpoint, like turned it on for me. I walk into that meeting and I'd have, 5 things written down that I wanted to talk about or throw out there to the group. And I'd ask good questions about pieces of the application that a training guy's not supposed to ask about that. And I'm like, no, I need to know. That's going to impact me ultimately. And from a change management perspective, I need to do some things and think about things differently. And that gave me the confidence, right? But people take for granted that every new experience is growth and has some level of ambiguity, and you're going to have to figure it out. And we don't give ourselves that grace. Like if we don't have the best answer right out of the gate, for some reason, the saboteur in your head starts telling you, man, you're really not that good at this. You really think you can handle this? Do you really deserve to have that? I think the answer most times is yes.
The way you said that too also reminds me exactly of what my mom told me. I was real little, like probably 7, when she told me, no one knows what they're doing. They're just figuring it out. Right? So when you go and you try to do something, just try different things. I also had an opportunity to grow up in a household that was very much like, try it and see what happens. So to me, failure is 100% an option. And I think that if we could embrace that more in the workplace, where especially like as you're working through things, you're gonna be wrong. And that's like totally fine. You're gonna get it wrong. Like if people were right all the time, life would be boring, but also we'd be lying to ourselves and about our organization.
Yes, Natasha, like I think that's great in your house. That's sort of the mentality. It makes you an explorer. It makes you sort of bold and not afraid to walk around that corner and see what's there. Natasha, inside of electronic arts, we talk about fail, right? FAIL, it's first attempt in learning. It's a catchy way to say some things, but it's just true. And I also say in some of my leadership programs, when you achieve something, you're standing on top of all your failures. You are literally standing on top of all the attempts, all the missteps. And even now, I will be writing a pretty large strategy for the company in terms of how we do learning. Now, I'm going to try to be informed. So I'm going to do some check-ins with leadership in various business units and ask lots of good questions and take lots of notes before I write a strategy. So I'm going to try to be informed. But I guarantee you that strategy will be about 70% right. And that 70% will be a heavy lift. And I will make sure I'm setting the expectations with my leadership. I like to say, like, look, if we never had a program, for example, for individual contributors, let's use a car analogy. First car can't be a Cadillac. It's going to be a nice Toyota. Very dependable. Don't have to worry about it very much, but it's not going to be a Cadillac out of the gate. So we have to manage some of those expectations. But it is not going to be 100% right, and I'm okay with that. I've tried the pursuing perfection thing. It was a waste of time. It's just a waste of time. You're just not going to get it. I'm like, let's get a very good informed idea. Let's try it, and then let's tweak it. Can we do that? And I think that's okay in most instances.
Absolutely. I know my mom used to say that there's no such thing as perfection. So if you're chasing perfection, you're chasing nothing. Don't chase nothing.
It's a ghost. Yeah, it's a ghost. Doesn't get it. As soon as you think you hit it, the bars move.
When it comes to empowering and encouraging people to change, do you think that it's reasonable for a leader to implement timelines?
Ooh. Oh man, that one's tough because there comes a time, and it's hard to say whether that would be an hour or a month or 2 weeks or 3 months, but there comes a time when you have to accept that things are not going back to the way they were. In the business space, there's some very real deadlines that we have to where we can't allow the change, or at least the majority of people accepting the change, to take too long. Truth of it is, they're just deadlines in life, whether it's business, whether there's life. But I will tell you, generally, I don't like putting deadlines on people. I kind of liken it to, so I wear a project manager hat often. I haven't done technical project management in a long time, but I've been a certified project manager a long time. And one of the things that used to drive me nuts about projects is the business would come in and the leadership would tell us when the project had to be done. They would throw a date out there in the future. And I'm like, well, if you really planned all the components of it and the lead and lag times, and you looked at holiday schedules and weekends and some other things and how long it takes to execute certain pieces of this, you really should be 3 months beyond that. They said, no, we have to get it done by this date. I always hated that. So even with change, sometimes there's a date that just has to be put out there. And I think you just have to be more intense in terms of your interventions with getting people through it. You might have to spend more time with them. You have to give people what they need, especially if you're going to put a timeline on it. So there is a very real, you can't just take as long as you want all of the time. In some things you can, but in some things you can't. And I think where there isn't the option of luxury of time, I need to do more intervening. I need to put things together to help the team get there because, hey, we have a wall that we're going to hit if we don't do certain things or if we're not executing in a certain way or demonstrating certain behavior. It's not a concept I like in terms of deadlines, but it's a very real one that we have to manage. Just try to provide more support, more interventions. Even when we hit the deadline, like you're still not done. You need to then be in like maintenance mode, right? Like, okay, we hit the deadline, you all are doing what we need you to do. Now I need you to really understand the what's in it for us and for you and keep supporting them through that.
I know, like for the example I gave earlier for the moving buildings, we had 90 days to do it. It took us a year. So fortunately they gave us a lot of grace. But I know that when I initially went into it, I was excited. And I think that I just assumed everyone else would be excited too.
Yeah.
And when they weren't, I love what you said about you need to intervene, figure out like where people are and what are the interferences, what are the roadblocks for them? Is it self-imposed? Is it other imposed? And how do we work through that? And really finding champions too for the cause. So there were people who were like, yes, let's do this. And I was like, you can move today. And they're like, I'm moving today. So to find those champions, but I really love what you said about that intervening, because it also goes with what you said earlier, like knowing your people. Like you need to know who needs that extra space, that extra grace.
Yeah.
You just need to talk about it forever or vent about it. Like let them get it out.
And I think, Natasha, one of the things we have to do is have to be careful with placing the labels like on people. Like, let's say you are someone who likes change. There are people out there who, oh man, this is different. Love it. I'm probably somewhere in the middle, right? Where I kind of, it depends. For people who like and embrace change and sort of can adapt quickly, we call them strong. So strong. It's happened and you just pivoted and just kept going. And then people who it takes a little bit longer probably should sort of, work on that, as a strength and cage it in all this nice language. Does not mean that someone who takes a little bit longer to embrace it is not still going to be able to function, at a high level. We got to cut it out and start talking about this stuff. I heard if there's anyone listening who likes sports, Deion Sanders, probably the best cornerback to ever play NFL football. Very gregarious, likable guy, talks a lot of trash. Or Jerry Curl, way back in the days, right? All the prime time. And on the surface, appears to have everything you could want. Like just a great man, very close to his family, And he was talking on an interview with a bunch of other athletes about mental health and how he wrestled with some emotional issues that you wouldn't have never known if you're looking at Deion Sanders in prime time on the outside, because he's such a flashy, kind of funny guy, like you love him, right? And he's like, oh yeah, I wrestled with some demons for years, and we just didn't talk about it. So I think it didn't stop him from being the same guy we loved to watch play football. So I think we have to be careful putting a label on someone who takes a little bit longer to turn the corner, calling them weak or any other term you want to attach to them because they just didn't pivot as quickly as maybe someone else on the team did. We need to, again, know your people and manage that a little bit better. But we do it all the time. We call it adaptable, right? Oh, he's so adaptable. We throw it under that. It's so adaptable, right? Be careful with that.
Yes, and the psychologist in me also wants to go to the thought that if people are too quickly adaptable, that can also mean that they don't attach to things, right? So there's not a certain level of care there.
Also, like seriously with the label thing, like I'm just sensitive to that because the labels that have been put on me is someone like Black man that grew up in the Deep South. And I just remember like names I would get called by other Black people because I was a darker skinned Black man, Black kid. And I was a very busy kid. I'd climb any tree. I'd turn backflips off of houses. I should be dead, okay? I was busy. So I'm funny about attaching the labels too easily. We all do it. But I'm saying in these instances where we're talking about change, just be careful. People sort of adjust to things in a way that will allow them to be okay when they're done adjusting to it.
When we put a label on someone, we're putting them in a box that we understand. And now we're going to go about treating them a certain way that we understand, making zero space for the person and the humanity in that moment and in that opportunity.
Yeah.
So I know that you yourself have been a change driver across many organizations, and you have been in different leadership positions for a while. So from a leadership perspective, how can a more junior person be a change driver in their organization?
Yeah, it's kind of like my same philosophy of like you can lead from anywhere. You can promote change anywhere. You can totally promote change anywhere. Let's use my oversimplified shoe example. I moved your shoes, and maybe you have a kid or even a dog, and the dog is like, the dog even is like, no, we don't put the shoes here, or the kid is, we don't put the shoes here anymore. The shoes now go here. And they're so cute when they do it that you're like, oh, little Susie wants to put the shoes on the deck because she understands we don't want the house to be dirty. And there's this concept of confidence that I have that I want everyone to have that is louder than the saboteur voice in your head. And so I think wherever you are, when there is a change initiative, we should all be assessing with our leadership, like what's in the change for me anyway. So if you have some sort of personal skin in the game, you have something to gain, something to change that's better for you and for your team, I think you can impact change, right? That may be helping to write communications plans that are relevant to people that sit at your level in the organization. Or going to we used to have these change management town halls where we would just give them more and more information. Like I never liked the project to happen to them. I wanted them to feel like they were coming on a journey. So we would have these town halls where we told them all the good and the bad and the ugly of the project and what's going on. You'd be surprised how people can accept bad news about the project when you tell them about it and give them time to adjust to it. And maybe you're sitting in there and you take that and you translate that for your team. It's not a spin in a negative way, but you interpret that information that was given in a way that is going to be relevant for people at your level and maybe even below your level. I just think everyone can play a part in the change. Maybe the leadership team have the vision, they can't operationalize and execute a lot of this stuff. The organization itself is who will say, this is what this means for this group. And then everyone else that is impacted are the people that will be executed. That's all levels. I just don't think you're too new to an organization or too inexperienced or too young to help people manage through change. You are not too young or not too inexperienced to help manage through change. Don't make it someone else's responsibility. It's all about us.
There's this concept of of course we need leaders, but does every person need a leader to lead them through everything? Where can people take the initiative themselves through their own self-awareness, awareness of their environment and stuff like that? But I think it also goes back to what you've been saying kind of throughout, which is there is a confidence piece that I think people lack, not only when it comes to leading others, but sometimes when it comes to leading themselves. So they really need someone almost to, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but they almost need someone to impose leading upon them. So it's like, this is what's next. This is what's here. They just need so much structure because they do lack confidence in certain areas.
I agree. In a corporate setting, you probably need leaders to put the resources behind it, and you need them to sort of make sure they're speaking the vision clearly and consistent. One of the things I used to love to do is get leaders in a room and say, oh, this is the XYZ change that we're going through. I need you to use the same words when you talk about it and when you write about it. Even when you start putting, I used to like to put visuals all around so people were constantly reminded of the change and what was happening with it. And I put monitors up around and like that had sort of our KPIs on it and when I could. And like you could literally see every day what's going on, good, bad, or ugly. So you probably need leadership setting that sort of high level vision, but like people are perfectly capable of supporting each other through a change, figuring out what they need in the change, figuring out when they're in trouble, when they need some support to help push them along. Like, you don't necessarily need a leader there all of the time rooting you on or cheering you on. You definitely can do that for yourself.
What leadership advice would you offer current leaders in any organization, in any industry?
I think lose the ego that may be attached to your title. It's not that important. I think the type of leader that we need is not going to be someone who's necessarily the smartest functionally. So whether you're selling insurance, building widgets, or developing machine learning, or making video games, or managing people at a retail store, I think your functional knowledge plays maybe a part in how the jobs get done overall, but like how you lead has nothing to do with that. You can be the smartest person in your function and a bad leader, and people are not going to want to do that work with you. Lead with your heart, human first kind of thing. Again, these are things that we used to not say in the business space, because I think the type of leader we need now is going to be someone who can do that, who can connect with their team and get the most out of their team. You look across any sports discipline, from gymnastics to basketball, these leaders got the most out of these guys because they connected with them and they figured out, like, how can I use your unique gifts and strengths to make us better as a whole? So that's the advice I would give. Start with losing that ego that may be attached to your title and your salary. It's not a good way to lead. Like throwing your title around is like, that tells me a whole lot about a person when it's obvious they're into that. Definitely get to know your team, empower them, figure out what they need to be successful. And then let's see, what's the last piece of advice I would give them? Grace. There's the word again. Grace and empathy. Those things build these environments on your team where people feel like they can be exactly who they are. And that's when you can figure out the things they do great and you can leverage that. One more thing I would throw in. Have a very diverse team. I'm not talking about physical characteristics. I'm talking about how they approach problems, how they think, and even possibly some of their experience. You all don't need to have the same experience. The diversity of thought definitely brings about new ideas. Right?
Awesome. This has been so amazing. Thank you so much, Kenny.
No doubt. I enjoyed our conversation. It's good to talk about these things.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Equipping Leaders podcast. For more leadership development content, you can visit my website, natashacheyenne.com, where you will find my leadership journal with dozens of articles and the Cultivation Cafe, which is always growing and has leadership frameworks, book recommendations, and inclusion and mental health resources. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha or at Equipping Leaders Podcast, and on Twitter at Natasha Cheyenne. Join me next week for another episode.